What about your year in Paris with the notebooks that you're doing now, and the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, and all your experiences there?
In my third year, I think it was my third year at Vassar, it was 1952 when I got a Ford Foundation Fellowship to go to Paris to work on the interviews connected with the notebooks of Gertrude Stein. I found the notebooks of Gertrude Stein at the Yale Library, where all her manuscripts had been sent after she died. And among them was something that I recognized after a while as actual a sequence of notes, and the notes added up to a chronological development of a novel, The Making of Americans. And that lasted for a period of about 9 or 10 years. And during that time, what she was recording in the notebooks was all the people whom she knew, who all took part in this extremely complex psychological system that she was developing. So there were 400 names involved in the notebooks all told. Some of the major figures that we still remember from those years in Paris. Alice Toklas, as it happened, had never seen those notes. They seemed to be so casual and so a matter of such a difference that she never certainly typed them out, and she never took them as being anything but scrap. And so she couldn't have been more curious about what these notebooks were. So we had an agreement, and the agreement was that anything that I would read from the notebooks, if I knew to ask a question, she would answer. If I didn't know to ask, she would not answer. So it was a game that we were playing. And the first interview that we set an interview for a certain evening. First interview we had, I started by the first note that I had. They were not yet arranged chronologically. The first note that I had to do with Marie Laurencin. And she said, "Oh, Marie Laurencin." Yes. Now the agreement was that anything that she said that we probably would not want to use, she would tell me, and she would say, "No, that's not for publication." So I would eliminate it. Marie Laurencin. This is the first note that I was taking from her. And as I was writing it down, what she was telling me about Marie Laurencin and her sexual proclivities and about her mother and so on was, even to me, a little bit shocking. Mm-hmm. And I looked up, and she had taken the pillow that was behind her, to support her back, tossed it up to the ceiling of the room and caught it again in glee and clutched the pillow to her and said, "Oh, I wish Marie Laurencin could be alive so I could see her face when she reads that." So that was the end of the need for the agreement about censoring anything. Then it was over. She turned out to be an absolutely fascinating personality, and it remained a game in many ways. For example, we would be sitting night after night in this extremely cold apartment because Alice Toklas could literally not afford to heat the apartment any longer after the Second World War. And there would be a 40-watt bulb hanging from the ceiling, a single bulb. I would be sitting there shivering, and I would be reading from the notebooks, and she would be giving me her comments. After a while, you began to hate one another in the course of doing that. We both loved working on the notebooks, but we both found it very, very hard to live through this. And in fact, after about 3 months or so, she got very ill. She got yellow jaundice and had to stop for a while. Nevertheless, the complexity of the woman gradually became clear. I've never known anyone who was so devoted to another person as she was to Gertrude Stein. There was no doubt about that whatsoever. She was totally and completely in love with Gertrude Stein. Her life was centered on Gertrude Stein, wholly and completely. At the same time, little things would suddenly appear. For example, I remember I borrowed her typewriter, and because she was writing her cookbook then, so I volunteered to type the cookbook chapter by chapter, and she was writing it. And as she gave it to me, she said, "You know, sometimes I hate that machine." I said, "Well, why is that?" She said, "It's a long story." She never explained. Well, why would she hate the typewriter on which she had typed all of Gertrude Stein's manuscripts? She hated it. On another occasion, we were looking at the paintings on the wall, and that's this collection. She still had over 100 paintings on the wall. We were surrounded by Picassos and Durans and et cetera, et cetera. And she said, do you know, she called me Katz. She said, that was an early decision, I'm going to call you Katz. So I called her Miss Toklas. That was it. Her dream. She said, do you know, Katz, sometimes I hate every one of these paintings individually and all together. And again, same thing. I said, well, why is that, Miss Toklas? It's a long story. You never explain. Well, those are the little insights that you catch.
Yeah.
And the explanation is, of course, up for grabs. But there are other indications as well. When she would explain, sometimes I put her in the position of having to explain something that Gertrude Stein had written or said. And there was very frequently a little acerbic style would come into her prose, which was not characteristic of someone who was in total devotion for the person. On the other hand, there was also this occasion. I was reading a note about Saint Teresa in the notebooks, was Alice Toklas. So I said, why did she call you Saint Teresa? She said, oh, she just thought so. And but we had the agreement, we had already entered into the agreement that if I insisted, she would have to answer. So I insisted. She got very angry. And she looked at me with beady eyes and she said, I suppose it was because Gertrude thought that I felt toward her as Saint Teresa felt toward the Christ. And in embarrassment and shame, I looked down, I was jotting this down, and while I was writing, she said, it was very stupid of you to ask him that. And I understood.
Yeah.
It was very clear.
Yeah.
The last day that I saw her, after a year of these interviews, which would last for between 8 and 12 hours a day, 3 days a week, that went on for 4 months. We were finished, and then after that it was just casual meetings and conversation and dinners and so on. On the very last day, I returned the typewriter to her, and I returned the cookbook, and I had given her the entire manuscript of the notebooks, and she had returned that to me. She was very much moved when she read them from beginning to end. And she said, I must say that some of the writing in it is some of the best I can remember of Gertrude's, and some of the truest. There's several people who Gertrude characterized in it, and she said, it's exact, it's just absolutely exact. She said it perfectly. And then just as I was leaving, she said, you know, Katz, we've talked about Gertrude for a year. I will never forget this, as a matter of fact. We've talked about Gertrude for a year, and all that time, I don't think I ever could give you an accurate sense of what it meant to live with her. You see, when she would walk into this room, the room would light up, and the day would light up, and the year would light up, and my life would light up. And I said, goodbye, Miss Toklas, and I left. It was one of the most moving moments I'd ever been through, because she suddenly, this woman who concealed so much, held so much inside of her, and was so complex before she made it, before she answered anything, there was a whole complex churning in her head, and so on. Suddenly, the face opened, the eyes were wide. She was absolutely open, completely open, and said exactly what's at the bottom of her heart. I'd never known such total and open confession from anybody. And it was triggered by the fact that she just read the notebooks and was so moved by hearing Gertrude's voice once again, so clearly.